At the end-of-year party, when she introduced me with that sparkle in her eyes, "This is Paul, my boss," I felt it. It wasn't the tone of her voice, it wasn't his smile. It was hers. A smile too intimate, too comfortable, too loose for someone who claimed to love me. A smile I already knew, because it had once been mine. In that moment, the world around me went silent. The laughter of my coworkers, the sound of the background music, the toasts and hugs, everything became muffled, as if I were trapped inside a fishbowl watching my own story unravel in slow motion. And there she was, so light, so free, laughing at something he said as if I weren't right beside her, as if I'd been forgotten. That night, she was with him. In body, perhaps not. But in soul, she was certainly gone. I didn't sleep. I spent the entire night with a taste of blood in my mouth that didn't come from any physical wound, but from something deeper, a wound to my dignity, my self-esteem, the blind trust I'd carried for years. While she slept peacefully beside me, I was on the other side of the bed staring at the ceiling, remembering all the times I'd believed in, "I'm tired, I'll stay late, it's just work." The pieces began to fall into place. Cruelly, one by one. And everything that had once seemed normal now made too much sense, and hurt even more. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I waited for her to leave, calmly embraced the chaos, and got straight to the point. Cell phone, emails, archived messages, deleted but recoverable photos, credit card receipts, location histories, forgotten notifications, clouds she hadn't even remembered existed. It was all there. The happy hour trips that ended in discreet hotels, the deleted WhatsApp messages that the backup still retained, the audio messages exchanged in hushed voices and muffled laughter. It was all real. As real as the lump in my throat that kept me from crying. It was like watching an accident in slow motion, except the car was my wedding, and the blood on the asphalt was the future I envisioned with her. I didn't make a scene. I didn't scream, I didn't throw anything on the floor. I just wrote a letter, a few words, and with all the weight of the silence I carried inside, "Keep him. I'll go in peace." I left it on the pillow and left. Without turning my face, without looking back, without listening to any explanation that would take me out of myself. Because there, in that moment, I was no longer a hurt man. I was a free man. She came to me that same day, confused, desperate, swearing it had been a mistake, that she still loved me, that she didn't know what she'd done. She said it was a moment of need, that it wasn't my fault, that she didn't want to lose me. Those words sounded like a distant echo, powerless, weightless. Too late. I looked at her and saw only the reflection of her own ruin. It wasn't anger. It was grief. The grief of a love buried alive by the cowardice of someone who couldn't choose the truth. And then, fate decided to return everything with interest. He, the lover, didn't want her completely. He never had. As soon as she became available, he withdrew. He disappeared. He avoided her. He said he wasn't ready, that it was best for them to take a break. She found herself alone, amid the rubble of a choice that burned everything solid. And me? I rebuilt my life. Slowly. Painfully, yes. But with dignity. I learned to be self-sufficient before giving myself up. And when love knocked on my door again, it came serene, honest, present. A love without games, without competition, without lies. A calm but whole love. The kind that chooses you every day. Months later, she reappeared. Eyes swollen, voice trembling, begging for forgiveness. She said she regretted it, that she couldn't sleep, that she dreamed of me every night. She said she remembered me in the little things, at breakfast, in the rain on the glass, in the smell of her clothes. She said she'd never felt so alone, that she even missed my silence. I heard her. Without anger, without hurt. And I forgave. Not for her. For me. To close that door lightly. To not carry any weight that wasn't mine. She cried. And left. Her every step echoed like a farewell with no return. Today, we follow different paths. She longs for everything she destroyed with her own hands. I, with the serenity of someone who survived pain and was reborn better. But what she never knew is that, for weeks, I dreamed of her too. In silence. That I also cried in secret. That I thought about going back. But I resisted. And it was this resistance that saved my life. She lost me before she realized she had me. And when she realized, I was already hers. But there's something even she doesn't know. A detail. A gesture. A scene. Something that happened right after the separation, and that would completely change the course of our story. Because sometimes, the true impact of a betrayal isn't the discovery, but what happens after it all seems to be over. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is romanticized or justified. On the contrary, we believe that truth and respect are the pillars of any relationship. The stories you will hear are completely fictitious, but based on real feelings, to show with intensity how betrayal can destroy lives, relationships and souls. Prepare now to dive into a deep, painful and unforgettable narrative. Sit well. Take a deep breath. Because what comes next will shock you. His name was Daniel, and he was never the type to command attention when he walked into a room. He wasn't the most handsome, nor the most talkative, nor the boldest. But there was a rare kind of presence about him, quiet, firm, constant. He was the kind of man who made silence feel like comfort. He worked as a financial consultant at a mid-sized firm, where few knew him beyond his punctuality, his always ironed shirt, and the kindness he extended even on bad days. He didn't have many friends, but the few he had called him loyal. The kind who isn't late, who doesn't promise what he can't deliver, and who looks you in the eye while listening. He grew up in a home where his father taught by example, and his mother with affection. He inherited his parents' simplicity and sense of justice. At 36, he had modest but intense dreams, a peaceful home, a life without excess, a woman by his side to share whatever was left, not the surplus, but the best. Her name was Laura, and she was the opposite in almost every way. Intense, talkative, ambitious, with energy in her eyes and a rush of words. She was one of those people who fill spaces with sweeping gestures and an easy laugh. She worked in digital marketing and had a natural talent for communication. She made words dance as she pleased, used her gaze to reinforce every point, and effortlessly became the center of attention. She was admired for her boldness, her creativity, and her way of not asking permission to be who she was. An only child of separated parents, she learned early on to fend for herself and never fully trusted anyone. She had a beauty that blended charm and intelligence, and an air of mystery that made everything about her more interesting. But what truly set Laura apart was her brilliance, a brilliance that, at times, was accompanied by a shadow she hid well. They met at a wedding of mutual friends. Daniel, as always, sat in a corner, observing, without standing out. Laura danced, twirling wine glasses in her hands, and struck up conversations with any stranger as if they were old acquaintances. When she happened to sit next to him, due to a lack of space at the table, they exchanged a few sentences and then an unassuming question: "Why do you seem so calm amidst all this noise?" He smiled and responded with another question: "Why do you seem to want to embrace the whole world at once?" And so, without promises or pretensions, began an unlikely story between two opposing worlds. They began to leave unhurriedly, without much expectation, but little by little they began to realize more about each other than they had imagined. Laura loved the way Daniel listened to her without interrupting, how he respected her silences while, at the same time, challenging her with questions no one else asked. Daniel, in turn, was captivated by her spontaneity, by the way she saw beauty in chaos, by the courage with which she faced her own fears, even without admitting them. It didn't take long for their relationship to become more serious. She said her first "I love you" on a normal afternoon, while they were washing dishes together after Sunday lunch. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her, as if wanting to capture that moment in every detail, and whispered, "Do you really feel that way, or are you just trying to live out what you think you should feel?" She laughed, a little irritated, and replied, "I never say anything I don't feel, Daniel." He responded with a kiss, and only after that did he say, "Then I love you too." They lived together for 2 years before getting married. They faced crises, of course. She wanted more activity, he wanted more routine. She dreamed big, he preferred his feet on the ground. But despite the friction, there was a deep bond, a kind of love built with effort, with daily choices, with respect for differences. They married in a simple ceremony, on a small farm, surrounded by trees, sincere friends, and promises that seemed eternal. Daniel wrote his own vows. He spoke of the calm he found in her eyes, of the way Laura made everything in him feel more alive, more urgent. Laura, with tears and laughter, promised not to lose herself, but never to forget where she came from, and said he was the place she wanted to end the day. And for a long time, they were that for each other, shelter, challenge, refuge, and impulse. They bought a small apartment, renovated it together, fought over wall colors, and reconciled by choosing the kitchen table. They began to build a daily routine made of small gestures, she making coffee when he forgot, he adjusting the pillows before bed, the two of them laughing at the market, sharing series, doing laundry while listening to old songs. Life wasn't perfect, but it was full of truth. And that was enough. Laura continued to thrive at work. She received invitations to events, networked, and spent hours online. Daniel understood. He admired her strength, the sparkle in her eyes when she talked about a new project. But sometimes, he felt left behind. Not because of insecurity, but because he didn't fit in with that world of influence games, rehearsed speeches, and midnight emails. He still enjoyed the same things, cooking on Saturdays, chatting with his few friends, listening to the music he'd heard with his father. She, on the other hand, seemed increasingly connected to the future, to goals, to numbers, to meetings in expensive restaurants, and to short but frequent trips. Still, they maintained a sense of care for each other. He waited up when she worked late. She sent quick texts throughout the day, with phrases like, "I miss you," or "I need your hug today." They had rituals, pizza on Fridays, wine on Wednesdays, walking hand in hand on Sunday mornings. These rituals kept them close, even when life seemed to pull them in opposite directions. But there was, slowly, something forming in the silence. A kind of distance that wasn't physical, nor explicit. An absence hidden between routines. Daniel noticed her eyes growing weary, but also more distant. Their conversations diminished in depth. Laughter became rarer. She arrived home later, justifying it with meetings, but seemed more restless when she was home. He didn't demand it. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he believed that true love also knows how to wait. He believed that sometimes the other person just needs space, time, understanding. And Laura, despite her exhaustion, kept telling him she loved him, even if with less intensity, even if as if saying it to herself. And he kept believing it. Deep down, Laura felt torn. She loved Daniel in a way she couldn't explain, but she also felt her life expanding beyond him. There was something about his career, his connections, everything he was achieving that made her feel alive, desired, recognized. Daniel, so serene, so certain of what he wanted, sometimes made her feel inadequate in his haste, in his thirst for more. And she blamed herself for it. Because I still loved him. Because I still wanted to come home and find him on the couch, in his socks, reading some old book. Because the scent of his skin still felt like home. But there was something inside her that was beginning to wonder if this was enough. And she, without realizing it, was starting to pull away. Not in the obvious gestures. But in the details. Daniel began having strange dreams. Dreams in which I saw her leaving, without looking back. In which he stood alone in the middle of an empty house. In which he heard her laughing in the distance, but never close enough to reach her. I would wake up sweating, my chest tight. And as I looked at her, sleeping beside him, I felt something slipping through my fingers. But I didn't say anything. I hoped it was just a phase, a wave that would pass. After all, they had faced so many before. Only this time it was different. Because the distance didn't come from the world. It came from within. And then, one random late afternoon, they received an invitation to a company party where Laura worked. Daniel didn't usually attend this type of event, but she insisted. She said it would be good, that he needed to get out more, that she wanted him to get to know the people she spent so much time with better. He accepted. After all, any opportunity to be with her still seemed precious to him. And it was there, amid glasses of sparkling wine, loud laughter, and rehearsed conversations, that something began to change. But it was not yet time to understand. It was not yet time to understand what was to come. That night, Daniel spent more time than usual getting ready. He chose a navy blue shirt that Laura liked, styled his hair more carefully than necessary, and even applied a perfume he hadn't worn in a while. It wasn't vanity. It was, perhaps, an unconscious attempt to reconnect, to show that he was still part of her world, even if, in recent months, he'd felt that world growing increasingly unreachable. Laura, upon seeing him ready, smiled kindly, but the comment that followed left a subtle mark. "You look great, different, a little out of your element," and she turned to touch up her makeup, unaware of the depth of that statement's estrangement. The company party took place in an elegant, modern space, with dim lighting and background music that blended sophistication and artificiality. Daniel observed everything with a certain elegant discomfort, maintaining a polite smile as Laura floated between conversations, hugs, and greetings. She was undoubtedly one of the most noticeable figures at the event. She seemed to transform there, lighter, freer, as if it were her natural habitat. And then, amidst a group of colleagues, she turned to Daniel and said with a gleam in her eye that betrayed no hesitation, "This is Paul, my boss." It was at that moment that Daniel felt the breath leave him. Paul was tall, with a polished smile and a confident appearance. The kind of man who seemed to know exactly who he was and what he did to others. But he wasn't the problem. It was the way Laura introduced him. The tone of her voice, the lean of her body, the way her eyes lingered a second longer on his, as if that introduction had been anticipated many times in her mind. Daniel extended his hand and shook the man firmly, but the world there was no longer the same. From that moment on, something changed. Perhaps not on the outside, the smiles continued, the toasts continued, the superficial conversation still filled the room, but on the inside, Daniel was no longer there. He watched, silent, the movement around him as if outside his own body. The doubt didn't scream. It whispered. And that whisper was worse. Because it planted a silent unease, an uneasiness that grew slowly, like a crack in glass that starts small but inevitably spreads. On the way home, she drove, talking about a new project, about the compliments she'd received, about what a great mentor Paul was. Daniel responded with vague interjections, trying to maintain a normal tone, but there was something between them. A space. An absence. A discomfort that Laura seemed to ignore, perhaps out of fear, perhaps because she was already accustomed to that distance. Daniel began to observe more closely in the following days. Not out of jealousy, but intuition. He began to notice the increasingly erratic schedules, the silences during meals, the lost glances mid-sentence. And, most importantly, the moments when she was present in body, but so absent in spirit that it seemed as if she were conversing with another reality. She didn't ask anything. She didn't confront. She didn't watch. He simply observed. He hoped that, somehow, the truth would dissolve on its own. But it didn't. It revealed itself. Slowly. One night, while Laura was showering, her phone vibrated twice on the bed. It wasn't an impulse to invade. It was a reflex, like someone listening to a call that didn't come from sound, but from something much deeper. The screen lit up with a message notification. Paul's name, above a visible passage, "I still taste your neck." The sentence was short but sharp. Daniel froze. Time seemed to stand still. The sound of the shower water mingled with the muffled sound of his own heart. He didn't reveal the rest of the conversation. He didn't need to. The whole truth was already there. His body trembled, but his face maintained an inexplicable calm. The pain came in silent waves, like a tide that doesn't take everything away at once, but with each return, takes away a piece of the beach. When she came out of the bathroom, she found Daniel sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. She asked if everything was okay. He said yes, got up, kissed her on the forehead, and left the room, claiming he was tired. He slept on the couch. The next day, he feigned normalcy. He made coffee, put the laundry in, and smiled mechanically when she left the house. But inside, he was devastated. He began to withdraw from himself. He started coming home later, answering less frequently, smiling less. Not out of revenge, but because there was an open, bleeding wound, and she didn't know. Or pretended not to know. Laura felt the change, but avoided questions. She knew, deep down, that she had broken something too delicate to be mended with words. Daniel began searching for answers. Not in the messages, he already knew enough, but in the actions. In the recent past. In the forgotten details. He mentally revisited every justification he'd previously accepted without question, every excuse that seemed all too plausible. He began to realize the betrayal hadn't lasted days, but months. And that hurt more than the betrayal itself. It was the time. It was the amount of things he'd experienced alone, believing they were still together. It was the amount of affection he'd given, thinking he'd received it in return. And it was also the amount of respect he'd offered while unknowingly being betrayed. One Friday night, she arrived home earlier than usual. She brought wine, pizza, and a tired but kind smile. She said she wanted a night together, that she'd been missing them. Daniel, no longer able to hide it, simply nodded. They sat on the couch. They spoke little. They watched some random movie neither of them had actually seen. And then she laid her head on his shoulder and said softly, "You're different." He didn't answer. He wanted to say so many things, wanted to scream, wanted to cry, wanted to run away. But he remained still. And it was in that silence that she understood. She had been discovered. Not by the confrontation, not by words, but by absence. By the way he looked at her now, like someone observing something that has already been lost. The following Saturday, Daniel packed some clothes into a small suitcase. He said he was spending the weekend at a friend's house. He didn't elaborate. Laura wanted to ask, but she swallowed her doubt. She knew something was wrong, but she still hoped it was all just a phase. When he left, she stood in the middle of the living room, her hands in her sweatshirt pockets, staring into space with eyes that were beginning, for the first time, to see beyond herself. He went to his brother's apartment. He spent the weekend in silence, reading, writing, breathing. He tried to understand how to rebuild a world after the implosion. And during the early hours of Sunday morning, while everyone slept, he picked up his cell phone and began writing a letter. It wasn't an angry one. It was a farewell. Short, firm, painful. It was a period without an exclamation point. On Monday, she returned home while Laura was still asleep. She left the letter on the dresser, next to her ring. She left again. This time, without a suitcase, without warning. She simply left. And didn't return. When she woke, she found the folded paper. She read it in silence. Her body trembled. Her face remained still. And then, as if the ground had been ripped out from under her feet, she fell to her feet, sitting on the bedroom floor, the letter in her hands, and an absolute void around her. Nothing made a sound. Not the clock, not the wind, not the memories. Everything stopped. Because what she feared most had happened. He was gone. But there was still something she hadn't even imagined. Something that would transform all that pain into something even greater. Because sometimes, what hurts isn't just what's lost, but what's discovered later. Time passed slowly, almost cruelly, as if the days insisted on revealing the distance between what was and what would never be again. Laura tried to move on with her life, or at least pretend to. His absence from the house was a jarring silence. The sofa where they used to lie together now felt like neutral territory, cold, devoid of history. The bed was too spacious, the coffee tasteless, and the music that once filled the corners now grated. She still wore her wedding ring out of habit, until she realized the gesture only prolonged an illusion. Daniel, for his part, distanced himself silently. He changed his number, blocked social media, and left no trace. Not out of resentment, but because he understood that, to rebuild herself, she had to disappear. She tried contacting mutual friends, his family, colleagues, but no one said anything. Every door she slammed shut harder, and the echo of abandonment began to echo within her with an intensity she had never known. It wasn't just guilt. It was longing for what she herself destroyed. The nights became her greatest punishment. That was when her memory made the loudest noise. That was when smells returned, gestures appeared in flashes, and dreams betrayed her with memories too vivid to ignore. And it was precisely in her dreams that Daniel returned, not as a ghost, but as a reminder. She dreamed of him walking through the house, smiling softly, telling her he loved her as if he no longer needed to prove anything. She dreamed of Sundays in silence, with her head in his lap, with the feeling of being chosen even on her worst days. But she woke alone. And each new dawn felt like a punishment. Until one morning, something changed. Laura received an unexpected message. It was a video. An unknown number. No subtitles. Just the file. She hesitated before opening it. Her heart beat differently. When she pressed play, she saw herself. The video was old. Recorded by Daniel himself. He was filming the house, narrating the surprise day, in a light-hearted way. She appeared in the background, with her back turned, cooking something. He whispered, "She thinks today is just another Tuesday, but it's the day I'm going to deliver the tickets for our trip. What she doesn't know yet is that I booked everything months in advance, saved every penny, because I want to see her eyes light up when she finds out we're going to Italy, the place she's dreamed of since she was a child." Laura clapped her hand over her mouth. That had never happened. She never knew. And at the end of the video, Daniel turned the camera to himself, his eyes moist, and said, "I love this woman. Even when she runs me over with her haste, even when she loses herself. I love her because she is my chaos and my calm at the same time. I just hope that one day she understands how much it costs to be loved like this." The video cut off there. And for the first time, Laura fell to her knees in the middle of the room, in tears, feeling a regret that couldn't be put into words. In the following days, she began writing a letter. She rewrote it dozens of times. None seemed enough. So she decided to try another way. She found out where he was through a distant acquaintance. She went there. A more remote neighborhood, quiet, almost poetic in its simplicity. When she knocked on the door, her heart seemed to leap out of her throat. Daniel opened it, surprised. The image of her shook him, but he remained firm. She asked to talk. He hesitated. But he gave in. They sat at the kitchen table, as they had so many times before. But now, everything was different. She began by apologizing. But not a generic apology. It was a confession. An outburst. A plea for forgiveness, spelled out in every word and with every tear. She said she had lost her way, that she had confused admiration with passion, that she had exchanged the eternal for the ephemeral. She said she believed there was still time. But Daniel remained silent. His silence was the most deafening. And then he spoke. He said the betrayal wasn't what hurt the most. That the greatest pain was realizing that, for so long, she wasn't there for him. That he had built a life alongside someone who, little by little, chose to leave without warning. He said he tried to understand, tried to forgive even before knowing the truth, but that now he was somewhere else. A place that no longer held her. She asked if he still loved her. He replied with a sad smile, "Loving is easy. Trusting again is not." Laura tried to insist. She said she would change. That she would do things differently. But the words seemed too late. Until he stood, walked to a bookshelf, picked up a notebook, and handed it to her. It was a diary. She leafed through it and saw pages and pages of writing. Texts, reflections, memories, pieces of the two of them. And then, she landed on a marked page. A specific date. A passage written in firm handwriting. "Today she betrayed me. And I knew it. But what she doesn't know is that, even so, I still loved her. That's why I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't beg. Because sometimes, loving is letting go. But there's one thing I'll never forget, after the letter I left, she came to me in tears. And in that moment, I saw that she finally understood. But it was too late. And that's the cruelest thing about love, when it arrives too late." Laura closed the diary with trembling hands. She felt the weight of time, the weight of choices, the weight of absence. She asked for another chance. She begged. But Daniel, with a calm voice, replied, "I forgive you. But I'm not coming back." She cried. He held her hand. But it was goodbye. He walked her to the door. Before she left, he said softly, "You were the great love of my life. But I don't want to be the regret of yours." She left. Shattered. Outside, she sat on the sidewalk bench, breathing deeply, her diary in her lap, her chest crushed. Inside, Daniel breathed in pain and freedom. Because loving is also losing. And sometimes, the greatest proof of love is not returning. But what Laura didn't yet know, and would discover days later, was what Daniel lived in silence after the separation. And that would change everything. Laura didn't go straight home that day. She left Daniel's house staggering between memories and a dull ache that now inhabited every corner of her body, as if the lament of her soul had finally found a home in her bones. She walked the streets aimlessly, his diary clutched to her chest, as if it were a last piece of a world she herself had shattered. Each page she read felt like a new stab, not out of anger, but because she saw, with the belated clarity that only regret brings, everything he had felt in silence. The love she thought she had controlled still pulsed within Daniel, even in the pain. And that, for her, was the cruelest part. Because there was no explicit hurt. There was no scandal. Only the weight of silence. A silence full of love, but with no return. In the following days, Laura immersed herself in the emptiness that remained. She tried to work, but her mind wouldn't settle anywhere. She tried to go out, fill her schedule, fill the hours. But time was now a labyrinth that always led to the same place, his absence. She began avoiding co-workers, especially Paul, with whom she had cut ties shortly after their separation. What was just a fling, a distraction, a fantasy, turned out to be a grotesque mistake. Paul didn't want commitment, never had. It was clear the moment she became available. He became distant, evasive, and soon, dispensable. Their relationship faded like a barely lit ember. And the most painful thing was realizing that, by exchanging certainty for uncertainty, Laura had single-handedly destroyed the only thing that was truly solid. Daniel, for his part, had moved on. But not in the way Laura had expected. Shortly after the breakup, he had met Helena, a serene, soft-spoken woman who worked in a small bookstore in the neighborhood he'd moved to. She lacked Laura's chaotic brilliance or her theatrical gestures, but she had a calm presence, as if she had nothing to prove. Helena met him when he entered the store looking for a book his mother had read years before. He said little. She could immediately sense the pain behind his calm eyes. They began talking, slowly, always about books, old movies, cafes neither of them had ever heard of. And what blossomed between them wasn't a sudden passion, but a gentle closeness. Like two souls recognizing each other after a long silence. One day, Daniel and Helena were together at a street fair, walking hand in hand among craft stalls and the aromas of home-cooked food. It was a sunny Saturday, and there was something symbolic about that day. He no longer felt trapped in the past. He was experiencing something new. Still scarred, yes, but with a light touch. When they stopped for a juice, she looked him in the eye and said, "It's beautiful to see you like this. As if you're coming back to yourself." And he smiled. Sincerely. For the first time in a long time. But fate, with its peculiar way of stitching together inevitable reunions, wouldn't let everything resolve itself so easily. A few weeks later, Laura decided to return the diary. Not because she wanted to leave, but because she couldn't carry it with her without feeling like she was reading her own sentence on each page. She arranged to meet Daniel at a park where they used to stroll on Sundays. He hesitated, but out of respect for their shared history, and also because he felt that chapter needed a real ending, he decided to go. The encounter was brief. They both arrived at the same moment, and there was a respectful but dense silence between them. Laura handed over the diary as if returning a piece of the other that no longer belongs to her. And just as she was about to say goodbye, something stopped her. An impulse, perhaps. A fear of letting that moment go without expressing what still burned. She looked at him with red eyes, not from crying, but from exhaustion. And she said bluntly, "You live in me. I see you in the songs, in the smells, in the corners of the house. I breathe, and you're still here. But now I know I don't deserve you anymore. And that hurts more than any punishment." Daniel remained silent for a few seconds. Then he responded with his natural calm, but with a definitive tone, "You didn't lose me because you betrayed me. You lost me when you stopped caring for what we had. When you saw me fading away and did nothing. When you heard my silence and chose not to ask. The betrayal was only the end. What came before, was what killed you." She felt her body weaken. The sentence came like a shattered mirror. And before she could react, he continued, "Today I love someone else. Someone who arrived without needing to compete with you. Because you were no longer here." There was no arrogance in his words. There was only truth. A clean truth, one that sought no punishment, only closure. Laura wanted to ask who he was, what he looked like, if she was pretty. But she held back the impulse. Deep down, she knew no answer would ease her feelings. And then, as if accepting the verdict, she took a step back, took a deep breath, and said, "I dreamed of you for many nights. And in the dreams, you still smiled at me. You still held my hand. Now I know they were just dreams. But I needed to say this." He nodded, his eyes welling up. She turned and began walking, leaving behind her last chance, her last hope. Daniel stood there, motionless, watching her silhouette disappear into the park's trees. And he felt a strange peace. It wasn't happiness. It was liberation. The certainty that he had done all he could. The certainty that, even though he had been destroyed, he had rebuilt himself without carrying the weight of hatred. He returned home that day feeling lighter. Helena greeted him with a kiss on the forehead and asked, "How was it?" He simply replied, "It's the end." Months passed. Laura moved apartments. She moved cities. She began therapy and returned to writing in an old notebook she'd kept for years. She wrote about the love she lost, about choices that cost more than one imagines, about regrets that come too late. One night, alone, she found a letter he'd written at the beginning of their relationship. She kept it in her keepsake drawer. The letter said, "I don't want to be the person you love out of convenience. I want to be the daily choice, even on the hard days." She wept silently, the paper between her fingers. And there, she understood definitively, Daniel wasn't just someone who passed through her life. He was the love of her life. And she lost him. Not by chance. But because she hadn't chosen to stay when there was still time. Daniel walked alongside Helena. They built a new story, with careful steps, respecting each other's timing. There was no substitution. There was no rush. There was truth. And she, in turn, carried within her the memory of the love she couldn't protect. Because there are things we only understand when we can no longer touch them. There are loves that die, but live on within us. And there are choices that, once made, cannot be undone. And Laura would live with that. Every day. Every dream. Every silence. Because some loves don't die. They just decide not to come back. Time flowed on like a river that encounters no more obstacles, flowing with the sharp calm of days that wait for no one. The reunion had left its mark on both of them, though each bore it differently. Laura, now in another city, tried to rebuild herself. Not in the physical sense, because her external life remained largely intact. She was still in demand at work, still received invitations to events, still heard empty compliments about her intelligence and poise. But inside, everything was in ruins. There was no longer any sparkle in what had once fascinated her. Meetings seemed cold, goals lost their meaning, colleagues were just voices in a long, echoless hallway. Because, somehow, she still heard Daniel's voice in the silences, felt his touch in gestures that no longer occurred, and carried a void that could be filled with nothing, not excuses, not distractions, not self-deception. The dilemma now was different, learning to live with what could no longer be fixed. And what was eating away at her wasn't the judgment of others, it was the weight of having been the author of the outcome. On the other side, Daniel was experiencing something that even he couldn't quite name. It was peace, yes, but not the romantic peace seen in stories of easy reconciliation. It was a mature peace, hard one, sewn with the threads of acceptance. Helena, who knew how to look at him without demanding a constant presence, made everyday life lighter. They had decided to live together, not on impulse, but because they felt a kind of serene complicity between them, free from the need to prove anything. He still carried memories, of course. But now, when he thought of Laura, he no longer felt the tightness in his chest. He missed her, yes. But for a version of her that no longer existed. And that freed him. The pain had transformed into learning. And the hurt, into a kind of distant respect. One night, Helena found him on the porch, reading an old letter. He didn't hide it. She sat beside him, silent. Daniel folded the letter carefully and commented quietly, "Sometimes I think I wasn't enough. That maybe, if I'd realized it sooner." Helena interrupted him with a gentle gesture, placing her hand over his and saying, "Being enough was never the problem. You offered everything. She just didn't know how to care." He nodded, without answering. Because deep down, he knew she was right. But harboring doubts was part of the process. Forgiving others, forgiving yourself. And moving on. Meanwhile, Laura was facing a different kind of reconciliation, with her own conscience. The therapy sessions exposed old wounds, unresolved insecurities, and untreated traumas she'd been carrying without realizing it. She discovered she sought validation in success but rejected emotional stability for fear of feeling trapped. She understood she'd confused freedom with escape, and that her constant rush was actually an inability to deal with the present. She began writing about it, first in notebooks, then in letters she never sent. Some addressed to Daniel, others to herself. She wrote as if trying, word by word, to empty herself of guilt, to understand her own complexity. Not to justify her mistakes, but to learn not to repeat them. And it was in this process that she began to see her story from the outside, with more humble, more human eyes. The moral dilemma was inevitable. How to reconnect with life after destroying what was most true. How to allow herself to be happy without seeming like she was running away from guilt. There were times when Laura would catch herself looking at strangers on the street, couples holding hands, families gathered in cafes, and wonder if any of them carried their own ghosts with the same intensity. She began to observe people differently, as if searching for traces of an invisible history. And this made her more sensitive, more empathetic, more true to herself. But also more lonely. Daniel, in turn, had become a different man. More introspective, more careful with his words, less willing to leave conversations unfinished. Helena noticed, at times, that he would retreat into his thoughts, and she respected that space without making it a problem. There was love there, but a mature love, one that understood silence as part of the dialogue. He returned to cooking more often, revived forgotten hobbies, laughed more. But sometimes, when he saw a couple arguing on the street or someone saying, "It's no big deal, it was just a text message," he felt a slight lump in his throat. Because he knew the weight of a single wrong choice. And he never wanted to be around someone carrying that weight again. One rainy afternoon, Laura received an unexpected email. It wasn't from Daniel, nor from anyone close to him. It was from Helena. A single sentence in the body of the message: "You may think you lost a man, but in truth, you lost yourself. He was just a mirror." Laura froze in front of the screen. She felt anger, shame, pain. But then, she felt a strange peace. Because those words summed up what she still couldn't accept. It wasn't just about what she'd done to Daniel. It was about what she'd done to herself by failing to see herself. By ignoring the truth of the love she received. By sabotaging what she wanted most. In the following days, she deleted old photos, saved letters, and allowed herself a closing ritual. Not the dramatic kind, with tears and promises. But the quiet kind. The necessary kind. She moved the furniture around, sold clothes she'd worn while with Daniel, and revamped the house. Small gestures of letting go. She started attending a book club, where she met people who didn't know her story, and where she could simply be herself, free from the weight of the past. She created an anonymous blog where she shared reflections on loss and new beginnings. And, to her surprise, she began receiving messages from people who could relate. Without knowing it, she began helping others deal with their own regrets. And, in doing so, she began to heal, little by little. Daniel and Helena took a short trip to the mountains. They visited a small inn, surrounded by nature, and enjoyed easy trails. One night, in front of the fireplace, she asked, "Have you ever thought about writing about everything you've experienced?" He replied, "I have, but I still don't know if I could do it without it hurting too much." Helena looked at him tenderly and said, "Sometimes, writing is the only way to transform pain into something useful." He reflected on that. Because pain no longer defined his life, but it was still there, in subtle layers. And perhaps writing really was a way to organize the chaos. The dilemma persisted, on both sides. Laura sought meaning in the absences she had created. Daniel learned not to define himself by scars. And time, with its invisible wisdom, continued to do the hardest work, teaching. Teaching that not all love survives. That not every story can be rewritten. That sometimes, the lesson is to understand that the noblest thing to do with a great lost love, is to honor it by moving forward without forgetting, but also without imprisoning oneself. Because forgiving isn't about going back. It's about freeing yourself. And accepting that some losses are the price of neglecting what is too rare to be treated as common. And it was in this unstable balance between past and present that each found their place. Daniel, with his gaze focused on the present, unhurried, without guilt. Laura, with her eyes turned inward, in a slow and painful process of reconciliation with the woman she was finally beginning to recognize in the mirror. But there was still something to come. A moment that would definitively seal the end of this story. And that moment was closer than they imagined. It was late afternoon when Daniel decided to return to the coffee shop where, years ago, he had taken Laura for her birthday. An ordinary day he had transformed into a special one with a bouquet of sunflowers and a handwritten letter. Helena was on a course out of town that weekend, and he was simply seeking a moment of introspection, without forced nostalgia, just the awareness that life, with all its twists and turns, found curious ways to return to certain places, not to repeat the past, but to confirm that he had, in fact, left it behind. He ordered the same coffee as always, but now without expectations. He sat in the same corner near the window and observed the street with the serenity of someone who had outlived himself. As he stirred the sugar slowly, as if searching for something invisible at the bottom of the cup, he heard a familiar voice greeting the waiter. He glanced discreetly, unhurriedly. It was Laura. She spotted him immediately. They both froze for a second, not in shock, but in a strange, silent surprise that brought no pain, just an unexpected mirroring of time. She hesitated, but walked toward him. Daniel stood gently and offered a nod. She asked if she could sit. He nodded simply. The next few minutes were silent, with both of them staring at the street as if searching, outside the window, for the words they weren't sure they wanted to say. It was she who broke the silence. She said she'd been passing by chance, returning from a therapeutic writing course. She explained that she'd started writing not just for herself, but for others, and that it had helped more than she'd imagined. Daniel listened attentively, with that same old gaze she knew so well, firm, but never invasive. She continued, talking about how she'd moved again, how she was now trying to live a simpler life, more in tune with what she needed, not just what she felt she should seek. I've discovered that silence is less frightening than I thought, she said with a shy smile. He simply replied, sometimes, it's in silence that we hear for the first time. She nodded, moved. The waiter brought her a fresh coffee, and for a few minutes, the two of them stood there like two intimate strangers, accomplices in a story no one else in the room knew. Until Laura, staring at the silver ring on Daniel's finger, commented, "Are you married?" He smiled slightly and replied, "Not yet. But we're building something beautiful." She bit her lower lip gently, as if digesting the news with more respect than sadness. She said she was happy for him, and Daniel, with the same calmness that time had given him, replied, "I hope you find the same. Not with someone else, necessarily. But with you." The sentence pierced her like a thin blade. It didn't hurt, but it drew blood from an old wound that was now healing. She took a deep breath and thanked him. Before they got up to leave, Laura held out an envelope. She said it was a final letter. It didn't need to be read right away, nor answered. But for some reason, she needed to deliver it in person. Daniel took it without question. They exchanged a long, final look, as if there was a silent understanding that this was, indeed, the end that was yet to come. Watching her walk out the door without looking back, Daniel felt a slight knot in his chest. It wasn't regret, nor longing. It was closure. That same night, already at home, Daniel opened the envelope. The letter was long. Handwritten, with shaky writing. In it, Laura spoke of the choices that could not be undone, of the nights she dreamed of the sound of his breathing, of the pain she had learned to no longer deny. She confessed that she had spent a long time trying to move on by pretending not to feel, until she understood that the pain only left when embraced. She also spoke of the happiness she wished for him. And in one passage of the letter, she said something that stuck with Daniel as a difficult but liberating truth: "I understand today that losing you was not the punishment. It was the direct result of what I failed to care for. And if I ever have the chance to love someone again, it will be with the living memory of everything you were to me, and everything I failed to be to you." After reading it, Daniel stared at the letter for minutes. He felt a strange warmth in his chest, like someone embracing a past that no longer hurts, but teaches. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He simply accepted it. And he put the letter away in a drawer, not with resentment, but with the respect one must cherish for a story that was once real but no longer belongs to the present. In the following days, he resumed his routine with Helena. He told her about the meeting, about the letter. She listened without discomfort. He simply said, "You don't need to erase what you experienced with her. You just need to remember that what you build now also deserves full space." Daniel hugged her tightly. That was it. Life wasn't about replacing, but about moving on. About making the past a foundation, not an obstacle. And he was doing just that, day after day. Laura, on the other hand, did something symbolic. She traveled alone to a place she and Daniel had dreamed of going together. It was a small town, surrounded by mountains and wildflowers. She rented a modest cabin, took her notebooks, her books, her silences. She spent days hiking trails, sitting by streams, writing under trees. She didn't expect redemption, she didn't seek oblivion. She simply wanted to learn to live in peace with who she had become after everything. And somehow, in that quiet place, she succeeded. Not as a sudden relief, but as a gentle recognition that pain doesn't have to be eternal, as long as it becomes a learning experience. And there, in that voluntary solitude, she wrote the last letter she would never give to anyone. A letter to herself. In it, she said she had truly loved, even if belatedly. That she had lost the love of her life, but not the ability to feel. That she would live with this loss like someone living with a scar, visible, yes, but no longer painful. And that if she ever loved again, it would be with both feet on the ground, with a clean heart, and with the firm memory of what she would never allow to happen again. Because sometimes, life doesn't give you a second chance with the same person. But it does give you the opportunity to be a new person with the chances that still lie ahead. And it was with this truth that she finally fell asleep that night, listening only to the sound of nature around her and her own heart, calm, finally calm. The final chapter was coming. And this time, no one would write on impulse. Only with awareness, gratitude, and truth. Years had passed since the last letter, since the definitive silences, since each of them went their own way, the wreckage of what they had experienced like silent scars deep within their souls. Life, as it always does, didn't wait for regrets, nor did it freeze for wounded hearts to mend. It moved forward with its routines, its surprises, and its inevitable twists and turns. And it was during this time that the profound truths of each choice began to solidify themselves, not as acute pain, but as parts of each person's identity, as elements that now made up who they were, not because they chose to carry them, but because it was no longer possible to live ignoring the impact of the consequences. Daniel had married Helena 2 years after that last coffee. There had been no grandiose party, no theatrical vows, just a sincere moment between a few friends and close family, in a simple ceremony, surrounded by trees and soft music. Helena wore a dark blue dress and walked calmly toward him, while Daniel waited for her with the serene gaze of someone who had found not just someone, but himself. It was the kind of love that didn't need to shout to be heard, that wasn't expressed in outbursts of emotion, but in small gestures, constancy, and truth. They now lived in a modest house with a garden that he cultivated little by little on weekends, with patience and dedication. One day, while watering one of the rose bushes, Helena approached from behind, rested her head on his shoulder, and whispered that she was pregnant. Daniel was silent for a moment, touching the wet ground with his fingers, and then he smiled. It wasn't an exuberant smile, but a deep, emotional one, like someone understanding the cycle of life closing in an unexpected and generous way. They were expecting a girl. And every night, Daniel quietly read children's stories to Helena's belly, his voice low and full of affection, as if telling his daughter that the world can, indeed, be a safe place, even after the chaos. On the other side, Laura watched the wedding on her phone screen. Not because she was invited, she never would have expected that, but because a mutual acquaintance posted a short snippet on her Instagram stories. The image lasted seconds, Daniel holding Helena's hand as she said something that made him smile slightly. That smile, which Laura knew like no one else, now belonged to another moment, to another story. And it was there, in that fleeting image, that she understood completely, there was no going back. There was no bridge. The love she had lost was no longer a blank space waiting to be rewritten. It was now the final paragraph of a finished book. She cried alone, not because she wanted that love back, but because she accepted that she had lost it irretrievably. They weren't tears of despair, but of recognition. Complete grief. Definitive acceptance. She continued her life with dignity. She didn't get involved in any serious relationships for many years. She was afraid of repeating the same mistakes, of hurting someone, or of hurting herself by not trusting her own judgment. She dedicated herself to social work, helping women in situations of emotional vulnerability. Her story, though anonymous, was used as an example in the support groups she coordinated. She never presented herself as a victim or a role model. She simply said, "Sometimes, we need to lose ourselves to understand the value of being whole." And, ironically, her purpose became to save other relationships from the destruction she herself caused. She became a strong but discreet voice, a kind of guide for those who still had time to make the right choices. And this, silently, was her way of making amends. Not with Daniel, but with life. Years later, chance played another role. A mental health event brought together several professionals, including Laura and Helena. Laura only realized who she was when she was announced as a speaker. She watched from afar, silently, with no intention of approaching. Helena spoke firmly but empathetically. She recounted, without detail, an episode of betrayal and overcoming, speaking about the importance of not becoming hostage to the past and the courage to rebuild without harboring resentment. At the end, Laura approached. She simply said her name, extending her hand. Helena squeezed back, unsurprised. They sat in silence for a moment, gazing into each other's eyes. And then Laura said, "Thank you. Not for staying with him, but for loving him the right way." Helena responded calmly, "He was already whole when he came to me. You were the one who broke him, but he chose to rebuild himself." And Laura smiled with sadness and admiration. She knew she deserved every word. Outside, after the event, Laura sat on a bench in the square. She opened the notebook where she had recorded random phrases and wrote just one line: "Some mistakes don't define us, but they shape us, forever." She put the notebook away and looked up at the clear sky. For the first time in many years, she felt she had freed herself not from guilt, but from the prison that guilt builds. It wasn't peace. It was embraced responsibility. That same night, Daniel was putting his daughter to bed. She wanted to hear the story of the girl who found the hidden garden. He sat beside her bed and began to read. His daughter fell asleep before the end, but he continued reading, quietly, to himself. Helena appeared in the doorway and smiled. Daniel closed the book, tucked his daughter in, and got up. Before turning out the light, he looked at the child's face and thought of everything he had experienced to get there. Of every tear that had brought him to that mature, calm, and secure love. He no longer felt pain. Only gratitude. And a silent relief for having chosen to start over, for having resisted the temptation to return to the place where he had been hurt. They left the room hand in hand. The night was cool. The future, quietly promising. And so, that story, marked by intense love, devastating betrayal, irreparable loss, and slow rebuilding, reached its conclusion. Not with a conventional happy ending, but with the kind of closure that life, when lived truthfully, offers: emotional justice, real learning, and new beginnings built with awareness. Because forgiveness doesn't always bring reconciliation, but it always brings liberation. And the story doesn't always end as we wish, but it does end as it should. Comment now, what did you think of this story? What touched your heart the most? Have you ever experienced or seen something similar? Tell us below, we'd love to hear your opinion. And if you're not yet subscribed, subscribe to the channel now to follow moving stories like this one, which make us reflect on life, feelings, and, most importantly, the choices we make. This story is fictional, but inspired by real emotions. And it brings a truth that cannot be ignored: betrayal destroys. It disintegrates homes, tears apart affections, and breaks people in ways that are often unseen. Cheating is not just a mistake, it's a choice that kills respect, care, and trust, and sometimes, it also kills the truest love someone will ever experience. This channel does not support, romanticize or normalize any type of betrayal. Our purpose is to show the real consequences these choices cause. Because a broken heart can heal, but it's never the same again. May this story serve as a mirror and a warning. Choose to love truly. And if you have to leave, do so with respect. Because those who don't care, lose. And those who lose, need to learn to move on without destroying what's left.